Hi, I'm David Futransky, ETHS class of 1969. I currently have the privilege of serving as the Senior Director of Institutional Advancement at ETHS, and that lets me work with both the ETHS Alumni Association and our ETHS Foundation. Today we're starting a series of conversations we call Coming Together, Conversations with ETHS Alumni. We have planned 3 of these. The first one is going to be with Adam Newman from the class of 2009 and Robin Simmons from the class of 1994. Robin is an alderman in the 5th Ward of Evanston and is going to be talking about reparations. Adam will be interviewing her. Our goal in this series is to give our alumni, and in fact the whole Evanston community, the opportunity to learn something about things going on. How can our alumni come together and talk about events, things, topics of interest to our community and to our alumni? So today we're starting with reparations. It is a hot button topic in Evanston and around the country, and Evanston is the focus of a lot of this work. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot. In the next few months, we're going to talk about topics ranging from basketball with alumni Dan Peterson, an international coach of great repute, Cassidy Hubbard from ESPN's Basketball Tonight, Austin Brown, one of the leading agents for NBA players, Brittany Johnson, the coach of the ETHS girls team, and Walter Pookie Perrin from the class of 1968. Pookie is currently the Vice President of Player Personnel for the New York Knicks. Mike Ellis, the boys basketball coach, will be hosting that conversation, which will take place in December. And in January, we have Jack Rako from the class of 1964, a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, being interviewed by retired history teacher Arch Bryant, talking about the role of the Electoral College, past, present, and future. So we have some interesting topics. We're looking for more topics. Please feel free to let us know at alumni@eths.k12.il.us if there are things you'd like to hear about. Thank you very much for joining us, and without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Adam and Robin.
My name is Adam Newman, and for our first session of Coming Together Conversations with Evanston Alumni, I have the pleasure of introducing Robin Simmons, who's going to be talking about our Evanston's Reparation Program. The Guardian has cited Evanston's Reparation Program as the world's first government-funded slavery reparations program. So Robin, there's a lot of interest in this program, both in the community and throughout the country. And so I want to thank you for having this conversation with us today.
I'm happy to have it. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
So can you first introduce yourself and tell us about your connection to the Evanston community?
Absolutely. So I am Robin Rue Simmons. I currently serve as a 5th Ward Alderman, but I am born and raised Evanstonian, native to the 5th Ward, where I still live and serve. I've raised my children there. They have also gone through district schools and graduated from Evanston Township. And my connection to the city is it's my village. It is the community that helped raise me and form my values and provided me with early opportunities to leadership and service and even entrepreneurship. So it was very rewarding to be able to serve in the role as alderman.
Great. So Robin, growing up in Evanston, I learned about segregation in the South and some urban areas like Chicago or Boston, but I never learned about the segregation of Evanston until fairly recently and learning more about this interview. Can you walk us through the history of segregation in Evanston and the legacy that it has today?
Sure. So for me, I will say that it's to hear so many people are just now becoming aware of our segregation in Evanston is really interesting. And I hope that there is more education in our local school systems to speak to that. But our history here in Evanston, we are beautifully diverse, right? Very vibrant, culturally rich, and it's something that we celebrate in Evanston, but we're absolutely segregated. The Fifth Ward in particular is the historical red line community of our city. And today it still has its most concentrated community of Black residents. But with that, it also has our most concentrated poverty. It has less community amenities. It's the only neighborhood without a neighborhood school. We have issues with accessing healthy foods and quality housing. So today, we still are impacted with the history of redlining in our city, although it has been outlawed in 1969, the impact still remains. And it's evident in the data that we show. We have an achievement gap here in Evanston. And as we continue to uplift our goals for diversity and inclusion and empowerment of all residents and being welcoming, we certainly should start with a community that has a long history here that has added tremendous value to the richness of our city.
What are some of the factors, in your opinion, that have led to the continued segregation, as you were saying, in Evanston?
One of the main factors would be economic inclusion and opportunity and access to education. And if we are unable to uplift ourselves financially and economically as a community, we will continue to live in oppression. And that has dictated the communities in which we live in, and having a concentrated community of lower income residents has dictated the priorities of businesses and where they come and plant their businesses, who might have the economic base to serve or support local businesses. And it has had a crippling effect on the community. In addition to that, we've struggled until recently to have uncomfortable conversations. And so we're okay to acknowledge our diversity, but to talk about the difference in the disparities in even health and life. We have a life expectancy disparity in Evanston between Black and white households of 13 years. So that's 13 years less that I will live versus your life expectancy. That gives you more time to build legacy, to build wealth, to create memories with your family. We have a $46,000 household income divide between Black and white Evanston. And so if we can start to talk about the data that we all see, and for some reason we don't work harder to bring repair, we could do that, and we could really start to move the needle and celebrate actual measurable outcomes and impact that is uplifting, and not just continued charity. And the charity is great. We have a wonderful philanthropic community and a lot of wealth that is shared, but we have to be more intentional about how that wealth is shared and transferred. And it needs to be shared in ways that actually have a measurable impact on transforming wealth, changing the trajectory, allowing more access to education beyond high school, allowing for additional resources to support even our students as they're in district schools. So my hope is, now that we as a city have embraced pursuing reparations for the Black community, that it'll be all hands on deck, that residents, thought leaders, our institutions, families will think about what actually will be an action of change beyond a ceremonial event.
So this is really helpful context into leading, as you said, about reparations. So generally, what are reparations?
So generally, here in America, we've heard about reparations really for over 150 years, starting with 40 acres and a mule. But in more contemporary times, reparations has been referred to as slavery reparations, with the goal of passing H.R. 40, which was initially introduced by John Conyers. It's been, as a tradition, introduced every year for over 30 years with not much momentum. But now there is more of the political will to advance it. It has more co-sponsors than ever. It has 162 co-sponsors right now in
And
the
this is
House.
at the federal level?
At the federal
Okay.
level. So at the federal level, it has 162 co-sponsors. It's led by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. That's 4 times more co-sponsors than it's ever had in its history. And it has its first ever Senate companion bill, S-1083, which I'm really excited is co-sponsored by our new Vice President, Harris.
Okay.
And so to know that she'll now be in the White House as our Vice President, I feel hopeful that we'll see federal slavery reparations in our lifetime. But reparations simply is a policy tool to bring repair to damages done. And in our city in Evanston, we have documented and verified intentional discriminating policy and practices that are on the books. You can read more about it at Shorefront Legacy Museum. And those practices, largely found in housing and zoning, led to economic damages, other emotional and social damages in the Black community, which is now remains the 5th Ward of Evanston. So reparations is not limited to HR 40, and it's my opinion that local governments should consider a local initiative for reparations, because the damages are done at every level. Although the transatlantic slave trade was a federal policy, and discrimination and redlining was all federal, those practices and policies were enforced locally, and those cultures were enforced locally. And so in our city, Evanston, the great city that we are, a city full of leaders, we have decided to localize, repair, and do our part with our cannabis sales tax revenue to bring reparations, to bring policy that will impact the Black community and bridge the racial divides that we have in so many areas.
So let's talk a little bit about the process, because 2 years ago, most people would say, no way this can happen, right? So when did you first bring this idea forward, and why?
So it was actually February of 2019 that I brought it forward to our Equity Empowerment Commission that is chaired by former Alderman Jane Grover. And it started with an email and a conversation. We should pursue this. And it started because at that point, I came into office not thinking about reparations, had never said it in a local context. I have always been an advocate for HR 40. But I realized that we were, award-winning and celebrating and passing proclamations and resolutions over and over again. I mean, I asked our city manager, how many proclamations have we passed in the name of inclusion, Black lives, Black history, diversity, equity, inclusion? There were hundreds at the time that I made this request. And our data completely contradict that our values were to have a inclusive, healthy, financially well for all communities, community. And so I sent that email requesting that we pursue reparations. And I introduced it knowing it's uncomfortable. Reparations, the word alone makes everyone uncomfortable. In fact, when I started pursuing it, I had leaders in the community that said, call it anything but reparations, and you've got my support. And I thought about that for 1 second, and that really would have not brought the healing that and pushed the conversation in a radical way that it has by calling it reparations. And so it was our data that showed we had a $46,000 household income divide and a 13-year life discrepancy between Black and white Evanston. It was our data that showed 70% of our marijuana arrests were in the Black community, and we were a declining 16%. It was the fact that we have declined to 16% as a Black community when we were in the 20% range in 2000. The decline of the Black community is directly because of the lack of affordability and the lack of sense of place. And I thought that we might do something radically different, as radical as Jim Crow law impact, as radical as discrimination, as radical as the unfair housing policy that discriminated and segregated our city. And for me, the answer was reparations. And to figure out how to localize it has been the really hard work.
So you talked a little bit about how local leaders reacted to it. Generally, how did the city react to when you brought this idea forward?
Because it had not been a local discussion, it was welcomed, definitely welcomed, generally, and with not as much enthusiasm, only because there was no best practice to reference. And as soon as I thought of the idea, I reached out to my colleagues at National League of City, where I serve with over 4,000 other elected leaders, and I serve on a national committee there, who has done local reparations. And I was sure that 10 cities had done it. I would be able to ask for their toolkit and introduce it at our city council. And actually no one had done it. And so that's where the challenge came in. Because we have expressed diversity and inclusion and racial healing as a priority and one of our core city council goals, it was embraced. And, the city council and the residents of Evanston were up for the challenge. So we have, we have a subcommittee that leads the work, and it's largely been led by the community. So after I made the recommendation to the Equity Empowerment Commission in February, I asked that the commission lead the community through a process that allows them ownership in the process and feedback and prioritizing what types of initiatives would be reparative, and in this case it was housing. But the community overall, the leaders have embraced it. I was really excited to get a letter of support from my senator, Illinois Senator Laura Fine, and Dino Robinson from Shorefront Legacy Museum, and many other community advocates and neighborhood leaders and other institutional leaders that have supported, including Monique Jones at the Evanston Community Foundation and other leaders throughout Evanston. So I would say that it was embraced, and because we're Evanston and we are up for a challenge, we know that there's a lot of work ahead of us.
So where are we right now in this process, and what should the community expect over the next few months?
So where we're at in 2019, after committee work, we passed Resolution 126R19, and that is restricting the first $10 million of adult use recreational cannabis to fund reparations for Black residents. We have a subcommittee, which I chair, along with my colleague, Alderman Rainey of the 8th Ward, Alderman Braithwaite of the 2nd Ward, and that's significant because we have the combined most concentration of Black residents. We have passed our first housing remedy policy in committee, and that is a $25,000 direct benefit to a Black home buyer or home-owner. So those Black residents who are hopeful to own a home will have access, if it passes City Council, which I'm hoping it does, will have access to $25,000 to subsidize and immediately build equity in the purchase of a home. And then our legacy families, our Black families that own already, we have, overassessed Cook County property taxes in the 5th Ward. We have a deteriorating housing stock. We've had financial trauma from predatory lending and even contract sales. So $25,000 could help with deferred maintenance. It could help reestablish equity in the home, but it certainly would build wealth. So we've passed that, and it has yet to come to City Council. We're working on the details of qualifying. At this point, our law department has helped us land on residents that lived in Evanston between 1919 and 1969. That's when we had discriminating housing policies on our books. In 1969, when we passed and outlawed redlining and fair housing was passed in Evanston. Or their direct descendants. So me as a multi-generational Evanston resident, I would qualify through my mother and grandmother and others before me that lived here. Or if you're not a legacy resident, you can qualify by proving housing discrimination. And we are working on a list of ways to take the burden off of the resident to show housing discrimination. We are receiving our cannabis sales tax revenue. We just received our first payment from the state last month, and we are expecting to receive about $216,000 in this fiscal year, and we have a projection of $400,000 in 2021. But in addition to that, I'm really excited to share that everyone can participate in funding the reparation program in Evanston. We have a fund at the City of Evanston, and it is tax deductible. Those funds would be restricted to supporting reparations through the program.
So as this process was happening, 2020, for so many reasons, showed us how stark racial disparities were in this country. George Floyd, coronavirus, there's countless things. How did that impact the process?
Well, for us, we had our process in 2019, and we passed it in 2019. So what it did was it expanded the engagement, the community engagement. When residents were in complete and appropriate unrest due to the public execution of George Floyd and let's not forget, COVID and the racial disparities on the health impact as well as the financial impact. So this summer, 2020, brought more supporters, more advocates, and even more members of the ally community that wanted to learn more. Maybe we're not enthusiastic about reparations before or necessarily an advocate, but the conditions of 2020 has turned many allies into very strong advocates, understanding not just the overt and the very apparent public displays of racial discrimination, but even the microaggressions that Black community members deal with on a daily basis, and the emotional trauma that even if George Floyd were not our family, just to see a reflection of you being murdered in the street over and over again, it was a really bad summer, that is traumatic. In addition to the lived trauma that we have through racial violence and microaggressions and discrimination and barriers to so many things, we have inherited trauma. So there's scientific evidence of transgenerational epigenetics where Black residents have trauma that has been passed down through DNA by our foremothers and fathers from the transatlantic slave trade and the era of slavery and the torture and rape and what the United Nations has classified as crimes against humanity, the conditions against Black people in America.
So I want, this was, it sounds like it was difficult to do, right? So what were some of the roadblocks or barriers that you faced to getting from when you first sent that email to where we are today?
So I'll tell you that it wasn't difficult. It was, tedious, as it should be, as we're passing legislation and dealing with public tax dollars and looking to serve residents. It surprisingly, and I get that question all the time, how did you do it? We had the heart to do it. We had the values here to do it in Evanston. We had already, earlier that summer, we passed a resolution, again with no action, but a resolution to end structural racism. And so it was that resolution that I used as our guide, our guiding light. And the proposal of reparations was really just, here's an action plan proposal to this resolution that we want to end structural racism. And so it was actually not much to debate. We had already that summer said we wanted to end structural racism. We had given an apology to the community for our part in racial discrimination. And here was an action plan to make good on that resolution or proclamation, whichever it was. But the hardest part really was to make sure that community was properly educated on what reparations was and how we got here. And so the hardest part was the time set aside. I work a full-time job, so the time to hold multiple community meetings where we took feedback, where we educated the community. And fortunately, we had the support of NARC, which is the National African American Reparations Commission. Its convener is Dr. Ron Daniels. And so we have their support and their mentorship, as well as NCOBRA, which is a National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations, the longest reparation organization in America's 30-year-old institution. So we have their support, and they've come to speak at our committee meetings, and they launched our work with a large town hall. We had several hundred residents in attendance, and we had national reparation leaders that were on the panel, including activist Danny Glover, as well as attorney Nkechi Taifa, our own Evanston son, Judge Lionel Jean-Baptiste, who was the first to actually pass reparations or lead the city council in passing reparations in 2002. And so I should say that having Judge Lionel Jean-Baptiste, who then was a second ward alderman, having his leadership to stand on, having his work to use as a reference to what we were committed to, was another great tool that accelerated the successful passing of this ordinance. And so we were already talking about it. The 2002 resolution was in solidarity of HR 40, so it didn't have a local component for governmental policy, but it did have a recommendation to the school districts here that they include more accurately and fully Black and African history in the school systems. So in terms of it being difficult, like, we are primed for this in Evanston. We have a diverse community. We have a heartfelt ally community. We have an Equity Empowerment Commission. We had a Chief Equity Officer. Every institution in town is looking at their budget and their hiring practices and human resources from an equity lens and working really hard. And we were primed for it. And so there was really nothing left for us to try other than reparations, and anything less than reparations would have been an inadequate policy response to the continued disparities that we have, racial disparities. So that's how we got here. It wasn't too difficult, but it was laborious, and I had to learn a lot. I had to learn a lot about our community, how we got here. You know, I grew up in the Fifth Ward. It's been Black my whole life, predominantly. It's changing. The gentrification is unsettling for the long-term Black residents, not because we're not inclusive, because that's who we are as a city, but because those homes that are now owned by new residents were once owned by friends and family and generations of families that we know and love, and they've lost their homes due to predatory lending, whatever it might be. So it's unsettling when we see that transition in the neighborhood. But I'll say that it was laborious. It was a lot of research for me to do on actually what is our data. And it didn't take, you know, $100,000 consultant to do data work. We have access to it. You can look it up on our website. You know, the school districts have access to the data of disparity. One call to Dino Robinson and a call to our clerk Devon Reed. I was able to get a memo spelling out the historic racial zoning practices that got us here in the segregation, physical segregation. And then just doing more research on just the place of Black America and the conditions of enslavement and how we even ended up here in Evanston from the South by way of the continent of Africa. So for me, it's been an incredible journey and learning experience. I've taken a couple of classes to become more educated and informed. I took a class this summer at Harvard. It was fantastic. And any opportunity that there is to learn from leaders, historians, academics, advocates, I've taken that and I've welcomed them to come to Evanston so that they can educate the community. So we're all learning together.
So I think a lot of people are saying, this sounds really interesting, but how does it work in practice? And you began to touch on some of the details, which I want to dive into a little bit deeper. There's a lot of racial disparities across the board, healthcare, education, housing, as you said. Why was housing the first priority for you versus other areas?
So the community led that discussion, and we had a series of meetings, and housing came up more and more often. And it's an appropriate first priority because that's the most likely path to building wealth for any family, and obviously for the Black family as well. In addition to that, ownership will help cement and stabilize our current Black population so that we don't continue in this exodus of Black families. As I mentioned, we're down to in the 16% range of Black residents, and I'm concerned to see what happens when our census numbers come back. But housing will allow a sense of place, a sense of value, opportunity to build wealth. It will stabilize Black families. It will help sustain our current Black ownership, which will continue to stabilize families. We have multi-generational families that are here, and our seniors have become vulnerable with their property because of how affordable it is to maintain housing here in Evanston. So if they can keep their homes and pass it down to their children and their grandchildren, that's the Evanston that we know and love. That's the Evanston of the past that allowed our numbers, our diversity, and our Black population to grow at one point, and it's declining. And so we thought that we would kind of stop the bleeding in housing in response to the concerns and the demands really of the community. Largely, the senior community has lifted up housing as a priority because they are the ones that are vulnerable to lose their homes. They are the ones that are living in homes that are deteriorating. We have an old drafty housing stock here in Evanston, and they need weatherization. They're living with leaking roofs and inferior plumbing and a whole host of concerns with their homes, which then makes them vulnerable to the letters that I get at my door every week. I'll buy your ugly house, cash. Who wants to receive that letter? And those are the types of letters that we get at our homes in the Fifth Ward that have not been improved. And, if you are financially vulnerable and you can get a quick cash transaction to help you pay for your, health expenses and other life expenses, you might be more likely to make a transaction that will stunt the wealth growth, and wealth opportunities for your families.
So within housing, how can someone spend this money under your plan?
So the way it's proposed and passed right now is they would be able to have $25,000 at their mortgage closing. So we're not the bank. You would have to be mortgage qualified. And we're excited to introduce very soon a financial institution that is going to make available a favorable mortgage product for reparation qualified residents. And so at closing, you would have access to up to $25,000 to help you with the purchase if you're a first-time home buyer or you don't own a home currently. And that could be also not just a single-family home, it could be a multi-family home as well, which is an incredible way to build wealth because you can have your rental income pay for your mortgage, and that's a great way to build wealth. If you already own a home, it could support you in deferred maintenance. It could support you in property taxes. It can support your vulnerable mortgage or your mortgage in general. But this is a $25,000 benefit to Black home ownership in general to qualified residents in town.
And in reading about this is a grant, right? Not a loan.
Right.
Okay. So for someone in the community who might be eligible, how will they learn that they're eligible? What outreach are you going to do around it?
So those are some of the details that we're working on. Of course, we'll use our normal platforms, social pages, newsletter, press release definitely on this. Once we get those details worked out, we'll certainly have a workshop, and we'll do intentional outreach to the social groups and other communities and institutions where the Black community is. The faith community is going to be an important partner in getting the message out as well. And we have various community groups, Black clubs, parent associations. The outreach will be broad and extensive, and it will certainly include a press release so that as many residents as possible are informed. And I should add that you can return to Evanston if you qualify and had residency between 1960 and 1969 or are a direct descendant. So you can return home to Evanston. And our hope is that residents that had to leave, I have friends that have moved to Gurnee and south suburbs and Texas and Atlanta, because it was unaffordable, and this might attract them back. And in fact, I've heard from them, and they're excited about the opportunity to return home with a benefit and being heard as a Black resident.
So will there be residency requirements, income requirements, preferences maybe towards seniors? How do you see that playing?
So those details aren't completed yet, but there will be no residency requirements. An early introduction included that the home had to be in the 5th Ward. That we passed it with no boundaries. Okay. So you can live anywhere in Evanston and you can purchase anywhere in Evanston. We have not looked at a preference yet, and we're likely gonna have to because there's such high demand and so little resource. Mm-hmm. And so even though $10 million is $10 million more than any other city has committed to Black reparations, it's not enough based on 12,000 Black residents. Of course, we'll have to sort out how many qualify, how many are adults, and so right now those details are yet to be established, but we have determined that there will be no residency requirements
within Evanston.
Within Evanston. Okay. So the benefit has to apply in Evanston. There will actually be a minimum mandate of residency. So this is a 10-year commitment. So the goal is that this will stabilize a Black family for 10 years. So we are asking that all recipients of reparations are committed to living in Evanston for 10 years. So we don't want anyone to get the benefit of reparation and have that equity, sell it and relocate. We are looking to sustain our Black community, grow our Black community, build wealth in the Black community, and we do have that requirement. There's no ward boundary, but there is a mandate on Evanston residency for 10 years.
So for someone that's interested and eligible, what evidence are they going to have to show? Do they need to hire an attorney? What resources are out there to help them?
So we're going to make sure that there's no legal burden on them to prove, and those are more details that we're working on what residency requirements. Definitely there's going to be some documentation that's required to prove residency, and we will announce that when we announce the details of the program.
So I'm interested also in, a lot of people say this sounds like a great idea. Mm-hmm. How are we measuring if it's successful or not?
So measuring its success is going to be quite easy. If we show a decrease in our racial divides in wealth, in homeownership rates, in the educational gap, in life expectancy, those are ways that it could be measured. So this will, because it took us multiple generations to get here, this program is designed as a 10-year program, but my hope is that leadership beyond the current council expands this really into perpetuity because of how long we've had to create this condition. Yeah.
So for these $25,000 grants, how many individuals or families should expect to receive one each year?
So we have a $10 million commitment, and we are receiving the funds over regular tax revenue. Mm-hmm. So it will be determined on how we receive the funds. So fortunately, the cannabis industry is thriving. It was determined an essential business, so they had no interruption due to COVID, and they're doing very well. In addition to that, we have 3 new license categories that we've approved in Evanston: craft grower, infuser, and transportation for cannabis. Those revenues will also go to fund our reparations. So where we had an initial 10-year goal, it will likely be cut by 2/3, maybe as much, maybe in half for sure, that we'll receive that $10 million and we can roll out more programming. But the $10 million is a initial commitment. The $10 million for me was a seed and a nudge and invitation to the philanthropic community and other institutions to join us in doing this work. My belief is that there is interest. We've already had private residents to donate to the fund. The Evanston Community Foundation is supporting the work and will be establishing a fund as well. So right now, it's too few is the answer. Too few would be able to get the benefit of reparation. And the ask of the community is that we grow this fund so that many more can receive the benefit.
So on the flip side of philanthropy, there's a lot of banks, there's a lot of realtors that perpetuate a lot of harm for many years. Are they going to be asked to, or are they still out there? Are they going to be asked to spend any money on this?
Absolutely. They absolutely are going to be asked to participate. And we, as I mentioned, there is a financial institution that is looking at presenting a portfolio of financial products and benefits from their institution. Very appropriate because the banks have been definitely part of the harm, but more specifically, the real estate community, brokerages, different real estate firms will be asked to support reparations.
Okay. So taking a step back and concluding with some reflections, what surprised you about this process?
What surprised me? I would say the national interest surprised me. This is very hyper-local, and so I certainly did not expect the national interest and the ally community really taking ownership and being advocates. There is a reparation ambassador program that is going to roll out soon. I hope to hear more from the organization that has been working on that for several months now. So that's been very heartwarming to see that there has been very, very little pushback. I could tell you locally, I received 2 emails not in support of reparation. And one woman was not in support and thought that we might be able to just do more diversity and inclusion work. That was enough, and we were on the wrong path. And she uninvited and unsolicited attended one of our 5th Ward meetings. And I really appreciated that. And she sent me an email and she said, you know what, I was absolutely wrong. Reparations are in order. How can I support? Can you give me a list of Black businesses? I want to do business with Black businesses. There is one other resident that has been not in support because challenging it legally. It's reverse discrimination, it's racially exclusive policy, and it's not legal. But other than that, it's been a very heartfelt embrace from the broad community, and that's been really exciting. And so we all appreciate how, as a community, we acknowledge it's a lot of work. We don't have all the answers, but we're committed to finding the answers and getting the work done.
And so as someone growing up in Evanston, what did you learn about the community through this process? Well,
I learned a lot from Shorefront Legacy about our history.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Shorefront and the work they do?
Absolutely. Shorefront Legacy is a Black history museum. It's located here in Evanston, and they're currently inside of Sherman United Methodist Church, which is on Ridge Avenue, just north of the Civic Center. Its founder is Dino Robinson, who's been in Evanston, I believe, since the 80s. And he founded Shorefront Legacy, just getting archival information, other history, material from Black history in Evanston and the North Shore. So I believe his work extends up beyond even Glencoe. And it is a resource for the rich history of the Black community. He has videos, He has physical archives. There are museum hours on Saturdays that are open to the public. Other times are by appointment. But I would recommend that every individual in Evanston, if nothing more than signing up for their newsletter and following their social page, learn from Shorefront Legacy. In addition, if there are organizations or groups, they can actually, or even families, I know I've had one of my birthday parties was at Shorefront Legacy Museum to get all of my friends educated on our Black history here in Evanston. Dino would be willing to put, and the board, actually a phenomenal board that works with him, would help put together a program appropriate for the organization.
And in researching for this conversation, I actually relied heavily on the work that they did, specifically, I think it's the report from 1900 to 1960 in that area about the issues that had happened in Evanston with Tribune clippings and clippings like that, and that was very important for your work.
So important. We would not be here today celebrating the 2019 victory of passing it and this far into the work without Shorefront Legacy. So I have to give Shorefront Legacy all the credit for having easy access to the information that we needed to actually advance this and justify the work. So our law department has relied very heavily on Dino Robinson and his team at Shorefront. They have a substantial report. I believe it's about 80 pages now. And that report can be read on our reparations website. So that's cityofevanston.org/reparations. And all of our information, videos from our town halls, our meeting minutes, the report from Shorefront Legacy is there, as well as other useful tools that I use as a reference, that our committee and staff use as a reference, the 1619 report, information on Narcan and Cobra, and other historic contexts is important. One other thing I should mention is we had a State of Black Housing report that was done by Mark Austin, who is a national policy, housing policy advisor. And he has a national State of Black Housing report, but he did one specific to Evanston. And it showed even today in the last mortgage reporting cycle, which I believe at that time of the report was 2018, there were about 1,400 mortgage loan originations in depository banks in town. And there were maybe 90 that went to Black residents. And it shows the disparity in Black residents being declined and not having access to mortgages. So housing is so important, and housing partners in this work is so important, because even with the $25,000 benefit, if you can't access a mortgage, it means nothing. Now, if you can access a mortgage and get it at a higher interest rate, that's predatory. So that higher interest rate is going to translate into a higher monthly payment, obviously, and that higher payment is not going to be an equitable wealth opportunity, because you'll have more money going out to your mortgage. So this is like, it's simple math. I mean, this doesn't really take much research. There's discrimination based on the color of our skin and based on our ancestry coming from the continent of Africa, and we need to address that. It's not good enough. It's not who Evanston is, and we're working on a way to advance change.
And so for the people both in this community, alumni across the country that are loving what you're saying, loving this program, what's your call to action? How can they help in moving this program forward?
Well, the easiest way is always to contribute. So you can contribute through the City of Evanston reparation program, or eventually you'll be able to contribute through the Community Foundation. But bringing awareness and sharing your professional skill set. So there are some more reports that I would like. I believe we can put a number to what is the wealth loss and the opportunity for Black community empowerment. We can calculate a number, and a reference is the cost of segregation. It's a report that was done by the Metropolitan Planning Council. And that report was an important early tool for me to use to show if we did not have this discrimination and this segregation, we could have this much more economic activity that would benefit all of Evanston. And so this particular report was based on Chicago, and it was a multi-billion-dollar number that the whole city of Chicago would benefit from if they did not have discrimination and segregation. And so we can do a report similar to Evanston so that we have more specific data and numbers that we're working with so that our goals can be even more defined and therefore the ask could be more defined. So if we have any alumni, which I'm sure, because go kids, we're all brilliant, right? Any alumni that is in a research space or has access to tools that could help us do more research would be huge. It would be huge because we don't have a budget. I don't have a team, you know, as a alderman, you know, we get a small stipend. I work a full-time job and manage my businesses. So
it's a tough job being an alderman.
Yeah. So with that, any type of intellectual capital, you know, just growing our knowledge network, weighing in, giving us a best practice to consider, helping us think about what the next remedy policy should be, because our ordinance states housing and economic development or business development. So we're working on housing now, but we will be working on business development. So if there are any business experts, mentors, advisors, strategists that want to join the conversation, our meetings are open to the public. We welcome ideas, we welcome experts, and we would love to have them come from Evanston Township High School. That would make it really special.
So, Robin, this would usually be the time where I'd ask for the audience to applaud, but obviously the world we live in now doesn't merit that. But I really want to thank you for this conversation. I want to thank Karen, David, William, and Chris for having us here today, and for the Alumni Association as well.
Thank you.
So thank you, Robin, so much, and I hope you stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. I learned an awful lot from listening to Robin and Adam, and I want to thank them on behalf of all of the alumni of ETHS for taking their time to join with us and to help us understand more as we come together to talk about topics of interest to our alumni and our community. In future months, we'll have conversations ranging from basketball to the Electoral College and other topics of interest. You can always support ETHS by going to supporteths.org, on the web, www.supporteths.org, which helps support the ETHS Foundation, which in turn supports capital improvements and many programs at ETHS. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us on a future show.